UFO healings are far more common than people realize. I've documented some 300 cases reaching back over 100 years and coming from all over the planet. Most major researchers have cases of this kind, and these cases are not getting the attention they deserve. I've come to believe that this is one of the main agendas of extraterrestrials, and this is the main purpose behind a lot of on-board UFO encounters. People are describing being physically examined, and what's happening is they're actually being healed. Their health is being checked up on and maintained, and in some cases healed. And the conditions being healed are a very wide variety of conditions, including injuries and illnesses, infections, cuts, bruises, I mean, you name it. Very serious diseases, as well as minor conditions, and chronic diseases as well. I have 5 cases which I think really show how truly advanced these ETs are and show how this is in fact one of their main agendas. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. These 5 cases come from across the United States and the world. And the first case I'd like to talk about is a healing of the disease known as diphtheria. This is a very serious condition, sometimes fatal, and this case comes from researcher David Jacobs. In 1962, Alice Haggerty of Trenton, New Jersey, was struck with the sometimes fatal disease of diphtheria, and because of a religious background, she had not been vaccinated against this disease, and for the same religious reasons, her parents refused to take her to the hospital. They did call in a doctor who said that Alice's condition was in fact very serious, but still Alice's parents refused to seek conventional treatment. Over the next 2 weeks, Alice's condition deteriorated. The doctor visited her daily, and by the end of 2 weeks, he told Alice's mother that he did not expect her to live through the night. However, Alice happened to be a UFO contactee, and she would eventually have several contacts throughout her life, but on the evening in question, Alice was apparently taken on board by friendly ETs, which at the time she believed were angels, and in fact she described them as, quote, angels in white robes with silver belts. Alice remembers being transported into a small rounded room, presumably a UFO craft, where the ETs told her she would, in fact, be cured. And they waved a small, quote, rod-like device around her body, and then had her stand inside a large blue cylinder with a little window, a porthole. And the ETs watched as a bright light was emitted from the top of this machine, this device, until it was about 8 inches from the top of Alice's head. The light then retracted, and Alice was instructed to exit the cylinder. And according to David Jacobs, the aliens, and I quote, informed her in a matter-of-fact manner that she was now cured and cleansed. Alice then underwent more of the typical procedures that are often performed on board UFOs, and the next morning, Alice's mother found her playing on the floor as if everything was normal. Alice was ordered into bed by her mother and her doctor, but both quickly realized that her condition of diphtheria was completely and totally gone. And later on, having experienced many other contacts, she realized that this first one was in fact a genuine contact with extraterrestrials. Later she believed she had been implanted, and she became a subject in David Jacobs' book, Secret Life. The second case I'd like to talk about is a healing of a hernia. This case took place in Gainesville, Florida, and the main witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Jim Law. It's a very well verified case. So Jim Law is an attorney from Gainesville, Florida, and I'd just like to quote his testimony of what happened to him. So this is Jim Law talking. I quote, "Sometime in the later part of the year 2000, I began having a strange dull pain in my left groin area. I passed it off as having possibly strained myself working out at the gym. I hoped that whatever I had would just go away and put up with it for several months. Sometimes it didn't bother me, but it got really aggravated whenever I worked out on weights at the local gym, and I began to suspect that I had a hernia, and I made an appointment for a full physical. And on 11/9/2000, Dr. Fine of Gainesville, Florida, performed a full physical and determined that I had a hernia, and recommended that I see a urologist for further consultation. I made the appointment with a person by the name of Dr. Senden. Dr. Senden performed an examination and determined that I had an inguinal hernia on the left side and recommended surgery. The surgery date was set up for February 23, 2001 at the Surgical Group of Gainesville, Florida. I was to arrive at 10:30 for pre-op before the 12:30 surgery. It was to be a mesh repair for a hernia in the left groin area, and I have all the medical records to verify all of the information I stated above. The doctor said that I should go ahead and have the hernia operated on, as it will never just go away. People try support belts and exercises without success, and the younger I am, the faster I will heal, and the more I will enjoy life without the nagging pain. About a week or so before the surgery date, I awoke in the middle of the night with a strong feeling that something or someone other than my girlfriend was in my room. So it should be stated here that Jim does have a history of encounters, and in fact in 1963, when he was about 5 years old, he saw a UFO hovering over Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota. That was his first clue that there was something going on with him, but he really didn't understand. But throughout his life, he did have more encounters. In his 30s, he began having really weird experiences, such as his burglar alarm being triggered in the middle of the night. He developed an unexplained fear of intruders, and there were other strange things going on, but it wasn't until this incident in 2001, when he sensed a presence in his room, that he really began to connect the dots. And again, I'd just like to quote Jim in his own words. As Jim says, "In my mind, I saw 3 figures, gray-colored, with big almond eyes, the typical thing that many abductees report seeing. They entered the room, apparently through the wall. At first I was startled, but I got a grip on my feelings, slowed my heart rate, and I told them if they wished to continue visiting me, then they needed to do something for me or I would make them go away. I think they understood what I meant. They, or one of them, said to me, 'We know of the condition you have a concern about and will help you.' One of them pointed a shiny object about a foot long at the area of my hernia. I don't remember feeling anything. I do remember asking them why they visited me like this. They, or one of them, said, 'We are interested in you because you have the genetic potential to live a long time.' I must state for fact that my grandfather is a very healthy 105 years old. Born in 1898, he has lived in 3 centuries and works out in the yard every day, walks without a cane, and looks better than most 80-year-olds. And in fact, I am writing a book about him titled Living Beyond 100. And his mother and her sister lived to 109 years old, so I can see why they would be interested. To this day, February 2004, I do not have a hernia. I have had 3 physicals since then. So this is a very well verified case of a healing of a hernia. In 2003, Jim decided to use regressive hypnosis to investigate this incident and others, and discovered through hypnotic regression that he had some 27 encounters throughout his life. I like this case not only because it's very well verified, but it shows that ETs do have an agenda to heal people, maintain their health, and are in fact interested in longevity. It makes me wonder, perhaps the increase in longevity over the past couple of hundred years might be due in some part to extraterrestrial intervention. The third case I'd like to talk about involves the healing of a ruptured Achilles tendon. And the main witness in this case is a former Air Force officer by the name of Michael Thomas Knox. And this case took place in Irvine, California. It actually took place at the Hotel Irvine during a MUFON UFO conference. And by coincidence, I was attending this conference as one of the speakers. So I was in the same hotel where this healing actually took place. I love this case because this involves a very reputable witness and multiple witnesses as well. On the days of September 24 to 27, 2015, MUFON field investigator Thomas Michael Knox, as I said, a former Air Force officer, attended the MUFON conference in Irvine, California. This was at the Hotel Irvine, and in the evening he retired to his hotel room. At this time he had recently torn his Achilles tendon in his left leg. Doctors told him that it was in fact completely separated and that he needed surgery. It would not heal on its own. But the next morning, Knox woke up to find that his leg was no longer in pain. And in fact, he felt completely healed. There were, however, strange marks on his leg. And Knox's roommate in the hotel room was a young woman who I'll call Melissa. She is anonymous. And she was amazed and proceeded to tell him an incredible story that had happened that same evening. She had come into the room around 11 p.m., and Thomas Michael Knox was already asleep at that time. And as Melissa says, and I quote, "I fell asleep quickly. Around approximately midnight, I was woken up and felt like I was floating out of the hotel room. I remembered standing outside of the hotel room on the rooftop, looking back into the window at my roommate lying in bed. Inside the room with him, I could see 3 gray aliens standing by his bed, holding his leg and giving him some sort of injection. I was pounding on the window, yelling for him to wake up." And Melissa told Knox that he was fighting them, kicking and yelling, and she said that both of them were actually taken on board along with several other people that she recognized from the MUFON conference, some of who she said were well known. So these are people who were putting on the conference and some of the speakers as well. So they were both taken up inside what she described as a cigar-shaped craft. And as Melissa says, and I quote, "At least 7 other people were also removed from the hotel and boarded into the cigar-shaped craft. On board, all of us were placed in chairs which resembled beauty salon chairs with hair dryers above them. We were all restrained in the chairs, and the parts that looked like a hair dryer was placed over each one of our heads, and it fit very snugly." So Melissa had the impression that the ETs were allowing the people in the chairs to transfer mental information between each other. She counted at least 20 gray ETs on board the craft, and she says that after this apparent information transfer procedure, some of these people were also physically examined, and then afterwards everyone was returned to their hotel room. So later that morning, after having flashbacks of all of this, Melissa told Michael what happened, and Michael himself remembered nothing other than sleeping, quote, "like the dead." But after Melissa had these memories and Michael realized he was healed, together they located a black light and used it to examine their hotel room and himself, and they found that he had weird phosphorescent particles on his leg. They also appeared on her pajamas and her bed and at various spots throughout the room. There were also what appeared to be 3 strange fingerprints on Michael's leg and a round red mark the size of a quarter on Thomas Michael's leg, I should say. And what's also very interesting is there was further corroboration of this event, because later Melissa heard a report that people had seen a UFO directly over the Hotel Irvine on that same evening. So this was a pretty incredible encounter, and Melissa did report what happened to her to MUFON and the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC, and later Mike Knox spoke publicly about his encounter at a later conference. So this was very interesting to me because I was speaking at that conference. I remember waking up that next morning and feeling somewhat unwell, which makes me wonder who were the other people who had been taken on board. But that's really all the information I have on that case, but it's a very interesting case because Thomas Michael Knox, being a former Air Force officer and a MUFON field investigator, is a really good witness. And that's why I wanted to present this case. The 4th case I'd like to talk about involves an anonymous boy who was healed of multiple body injuries. He had injured himself very badly due to a fall and had actually lapsed into a coma. And the main witness in this case is an electrical engineer by the name of Victor Kapetanovic, and this case took place in Peru, more specifically in the Callejon de Huaylas area of Peru. This is a very interesting case because the main witness, Victor, actually became a contactee following his witnessing of this healing of this young boy. On March 10, 1960, Victor Kapetanovic, a Peruvian electrical engineer, was hunting with a local guide in the Callejon de Huaylas region. This is a rural area in Peru inhabited by native Peruvians. And they were traveling through a remote local village when they came upon a family whose son had recently fallen from a cliff and now was apparently dying of his injuries. And Victor was taken to see the child. According to Victor, this boy was lying on the floor of the hut, unmoving, and as he says, and I quote, "His swollen face had taken on a bluish color by the infections. His eyes were half closed, his mouth half open, with his tongue and lips swollen. He looked terrible." So he bent down to examine the boy, could barely detect a pulse, and saw that the boy was in fact in a comatose state. And the closest hospital was many, many miles away, but Victor offered to transport the child, and the boy's mother angrily refused and explained that, quote, "the gods from the sky would take care of her son." And Victor's guide explained that the locals are often in contact with UFO beings, whom they called sky gods. And Victor was intrigued by this because he had recently seen many of these strange discs himself. So he decided to stay and see if this was true, and that if the ETs would show up and heal this boy. And sure enough, they did. It was a short time later, the sky filled with clouds suddenly, and without warning, the boy's family began to shout and point, and looking up, Victor saw, quote, "an apparatus similar to a small airplane drop out of the clouds and land silently among the herd of sheep and goats." And he first thought it might be the Peruvian military until he saw that this object looked very strange. It was not a plane. A door opened and a figure emerged. It was a female woman. She looked entirely human, though her skin was quite pale, and she was very short, and also she was dressed in a full body suit, unlike anything Victor had seen before. and she actually floated towards them a few inches above the ground. At this point, Victor's guide and the entire Peruvian family dropped to their knees and began to pray. And this female figure told them to rise up. She entered the hut, scooped up the child, and carried him into the landed craft. And Victor watched all this as the door to the craft closed. And after several minutes, the door opened, and as Victor says, and I quote, "Suddenly I saw the boy descend alone from the ladder of the ship, and upon touching the ground, he ran towards us, reaching down to pick up a stone, and thus showing his perfect state of health. Having seen him when he was swollen, I did not recognize him now, and thought that he must be another boy, a member of the crew perhaps. Then I waited for the reaction of the mother of the child. The little boy had not covered half the distance from the ship to us when his mother ran toward him, shouting in emotion. All present embraced and gave shouts of joy." So at this point, the ET woman exited the craft and spoke briefly with everyone there, and Victor immediately approached the boy and began to examine him, checking his injuries. And as he says, "Who knows how they effected this cure, but I could find no evidence of surgery on his arms. The boy showed no abnormality in his body." So at this point, Victor approached the ET woman, who said that her name was Ivanka, and she actually invited him on board the ship, where he saw many other ETs, had a long conversation with them. They showed him a screen which portrayed scenes of future events, and this started a very long series of contacts with Victor Kapitanovic, and he later wrote an entire book about his experiences with these human-looking ETs. It's a very interesting case. And the fifth and final case I'd like to talk about today involves the healing of a man who had chronic liver disease. This case took place in Givenchy, France, and the main witness is a man by the name of Gilbert Camus. He's a radio engineer, and he was suffering from a very bad case of liver disease, which was becoming progressively worse. Gilbert Camus was again a radio engineer from the Givenchy area of France, and he had a shop in Givenchy and another in the Zavagny area in the Saône-et-Loire area of France. So because of this, he made frequent trips between the two shops, up to 4 trips per day. This is on the secondary road D30, and it was here that he experienced an encounter that really frightened him. This occurred on March 5th, 1971, and this was at 1:10 a.m., so very much in the early hours. And it was under a moonlit sky. It was a very cold night, minus 20 degrees Celsius, which is just below 0 in Fahrenheit. And he was driving home in his Peugeot 404 car and had just crossed by the small village of Trenal. And after passing the last house in this town, on this road, which is a straight line for the next mile or two, he was driving at 100 kilometers per hour, about 60 miles per hour, when he saw a strange light ahead of him. And he first thought it might be the lights of the next town, the town of Condamine, but as he approached he saw that it wasn't, and in fact these lights were coming from the woods. So he paid closer attention and saw that there were in fact 8 lights located just in front of the woods by a large meadow on the right side of the road. And as he's driving by, he sees that these lights were laid out regularly at ground level, parallel with the edge of the forest, and that they were rectangles of soft bluish color, almost fluorescent, and not dazzling or bright, but a soft light. And looking above them, he saw that these were probably windows or portholes attached to a kind of dome of dull metallic appearance. And he could barely see this under the reflection of the moon, And he realized that, staring at this object, that it was a half sphere, flattened a little bit. It was below the height of the trees. It was actually landed, and he estimated that its height was about 8 meters, 24 feet, and about 15 meters wide, 45 feet wide. And if there had been no moon that night, he probably would not have been able to see this, and he could not really see the lower part of this dome-shaped craft. But as he noticed this craft, looking to the trees next to it, he saw 3 beings. And they were climbing up the slope towards the road where his car was. And it shocked him because they were on all fours, crawling on arms and legs. And they were quite large. He described these beings as being tan in color with huge insect-like heads. So perhaps praying mantis as opposed to greys. It's not clear. But as he watched these 3 beings, they were not moving. And this is when he became a little bit frightened, and became even more frightened when looking at the meadow again. He saw that there was at least 20 more of these same figures. Some of them were standing upright, others were going on all fours as if they were looking for something on the ground. He could hear no noise other than his car, and as he's driving by all of this, he noticed a white, or perhaps a pale blue beam of light, which shone on the back of his car and filled his car with illumination. It also lit up the entire woods around him. And looking in the rear view mirror, it looked like there was a beam of light being projected at him. And he saw that there were more beings, and they were of different sizes. Some were quite tall, others were shorter. And at the same time he was being hit by this beam of light, something very interesting happened. His fear completely left him. And not only that, he felt like he was no longer in control of his car, and that his car was in fact being controlled, and that he could not steer it or anything. And in fact, he was surprised he didn't have an accident. He felt like the ignition of the car failed, and he said that the car slowed down from 60 miles per hour all the way down to about 12 miles per hour, even though it was still in 4th gear. And I'll just quote Gilbert directly, as he says, and I quote, "I had just passed them when an intense gleam filled my car. From this moment, I was not aware any more of what I did. The car continued to run. I had the impression that it drove on its own, that I would have been unable to avoid an obstacle or an accident. Its speed had fallen to 20 kilometers per hour in less than 100 meters, as if there had been a breakdown of the ignition. And a little further, I realized that the hood had become fluorescent. This anomaly did not last, and little by little, without me intervening, the engine resumed its normal operation." So at this time, the car accelerated again to about 60 miles per hour, and he did not do this consciously. He says he was completely disoriented at this point and just continued his trip until he reached the town of Condamine, where he recovered and then drove to his home in Savigny. And so once he arrived home, he took his clothes off and was amazed to see that on his shirt there was about 7 or 8 traces in the shape of a rectangle. These were about 5 centimeters to 2 centimeters in size, 1 by 2 inches, and they were all on the left side, and they were sort of gold in color, a little bit phosphorescent, and they did not last long, only about 5 or 6 minutes after he took his shirt off. And so he went to bed, and the next day he decided he would go back to this area with his son to see if he could find any traces of what had happened. And he did not see anything at first at the exact place where these beings were, but in the meadow at the edge of the wood, he immediately saw that the grass had been crushed down in a sort of half spherical shape. And this was about 30 feet in length, and it crossed over the drainage ditch to about 6 feet in width. And another thing that was very strange, this was a very cold night, and there was snow and ice alongside of the road. However, in this area where this object had apparently landed, the water had been melted. And in fact, his son said that it actually seemed to be warm. So this was quite strange, and there was at least an area of about 45 to 50 feet where the snow and ice was completely melted. And checking around this area, he saw strange footsteps, which looked like shoes, except there were no heels in the shoes. And these were quite large, actually. And doing some more examination, he saw that a large branch of a tree had apparently been torn off. And even more interesting, he noticed that a bunch of flowers had disappeared in the area where this object had landed. These flowers are known as Leontodron crispus, perhaps better known as dandelions. The dandelions do have all kinds of medicinal qualities, such as antioxidant qualities or anti-inflammatory and more. And in fact, ufologist Jean Tirode investigated this case and verified that these dandelion-like yellow flowers were in fact missing in a very large area. They had been picked. So Gilbert Camus, the witness, was fairly well known in his community, and he had no problem telling everybody what happened. So a lot of people went to investigate this area and verified these landing traces and the missing flowers. It was 3 days after the encounter that Gilbert saw these same rectangular marks on his shirt. What was weird is they were on his undershirt. They were brown in color. What was weird is they were not on his coat or anything. So he couldn't explain how they were on his undershirt but not on the outside of his clothes. So it's entirely possible he had missing time. There were other traces as well. The following day, the green painting on his Peugeot car faded. And when he washed it, the green paint came off on the rags. So Gilbert stopped washing it, thinking he was going to just pull the paint right off. This also was verified by ufologist Jean Tirode. But most importantly here, is that Gilbert Camus at the time was suffering from liver disease. It was causing him all kinds of problems. He was having terrible headaches. His appetite was suffering. In fact, his health was so bad, he had reached the point of deep depression and just did not want to go on anymore. And it was the next day after his encounter that he realized he was not having headaches. His appetite was returning, and as the days went on, he just felt better and better. And 6 months later, he was completely healthy, he says. He had previously been unable to eat anything, but shortly following this incident, his appetite returned, his liver returned to normal, his headaches disappeared, and never came back. He was healthy. So this was a very interesting case, very well verified in terms of the many physical traces on the ground, on his car, on his body. I suspect that he was, in fact, did have an onboard encounter, given that he was healed. It's interesting that they were picking dandelions, these ETs, which do have healing qualities, so maybe those two incidents are linked, the healing and the use of dandelions. Hard to say, that's pure speculation. However, the case was quite a sensation in France. In fact, the UFO group, Lumière dans la Nuit, took a great interest in this case. Ufologists Jean Tirode and Pierre Longchamp were the main investigators, and they spoke with the witness shortly after it happened. And according to Jean Tirode, he felt that Gilbert Camus was a very credible witness, a very sensible and honest man, and he found other witnesses in the area who also vouched for Gilbert's credibility and sincerity, and there is no doubt in the investigator's mind that Gilbert was being entirely truthful about what happened to him. So it's a very interesting case. So those are the 5 cases that I wanted to present to you today. And as you can see, they do provide some very interesting insights into the nature of ET contact. It should be pretty obvious by now that ETs are here healing people on a widespread basis of a variety of conditions. And I think these cases do deserve more attention. They show how truly advanced ETs are and that they are, in fact, here to help us. And that's really why I wanted to do this episode for you today. I think these cases show the truth behind the purpose of ET contact.